November 28, 1960. Two Italian radio amateurs searched the vastness of the night for radio frequencies used by Soviet Union satellites, until at a certain moment, the silence was finally broken by a noise. A kind of code that is repeated over and over again. The signal had an increasingly lower frequency and an increasingly longer wavelength. Based on the Doppler effect, this meant that the object, whatever it was moving away from the Earth. So, intrigued, the operators analyzed the signal and managed to decipher its meaning. It was a Morse code message, which could be translated into just 3 letters. SOS. This is just one of several stories that fuel a fascinating mystery. An enigma that has already been the subject of studies, research and, of course, many conspiracy theories. Has an astronaut ever been lost in space? The famous photo of American astronaut Bruce McCandless leaves us amazed, but it also causes a certain amount of panic. Imagine being completely adrift, enveloped in darkness, seeing the Earth hundreds of kilometers away from your feet. In his case, it was a calculated move. Everything was under control. He returned safely to space from the ship and shortly afterwards to Earth. But has any human being ever been thrown into the vastness of infinity and never returned? There are many stories about supposed lost astronauts, or to be more precise, lost cosmonauts. The difference, in fact, is just the location on the birth certificate. The word astronaut is often used to refer to citizens of the United States and from other countries. A cosmonaut was born in Russia or the former Soviet Union. And there are also the takenauts, who are Chinese people who travel through space. But whatever the name, the fact is that there are a series of suspenseful reports about people who died in some way in space and whose stories were discovered by authorities on Earth. Most of these cases would have happened during the Cold War. At that time the world was on high alert due to tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. Just as on Earth as in heaven. A space race began to take shape and the universe became a new trench in the battle between the great global powers. Americans and Soviets fought over who would make the greatest advances in exploring the universe. And although the United States was the first to reach the moon in 1969, the Soviets kind of pioneered a lot of other achievements before that. They were the ones who sent the first object into orbit, Sputnik 1. They were the ones who sent the first man into space, Yuri Gagarin. They were the ones who sent the first woman into space, Valentina Tereshkova. And they were the ones who sent the first dog into space. It was the dog Laika. Poor Laika. She went and never came back. But if on the one hand the Soviets were pioneers in a lot of cool things in space, they were also the first in great tragedies. The first death on a space mission, for example, was that of cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov on Soyuz 1 in 1967. His capsule's parachutes did not work when re-entering the atmosphere and it crashed at full speed into the ground here on Earth. A few years later, in 1971, another road tragedy. It's once again time to re-enter the atmosphere. The Soyuz 11 capsule suffered a depressurization and the 3 cosmonauts on board died instantly. And because of this risk of failure, it was common for governments at the time not to inform space missions in advance. Often they were only released after the rocket had already left the atmosphere. And then, if everything goes well, great. But if something went wrong, the authorities covered it up and gave it some other name, so they wouldn't have to admit that a tragedy had occurred in the space program. And that's because one of the most important elements in the Cold War was propaganda. Any sign of defeat could be exposed by another country and used to demoralize the opposing regime. And because of this, there were a series of suspicious cases that the Soviet authorities they tried to sweep it under the rug. And the most serious of all was certainly the Netherlands catastrophe in 1960. This catastrophe was a huge explosion that happened while a missile was being prepared for launch. The Soviet Union tried to hush up the case and to this day it is not known exactly how many people died, but it is estimated that it was somewhere between 60 and 150. There are also other symbolic cases. The death of Yuri Gagarin himself, the first person to go into space, is still surrounded by mysteries to this day. He died in 1968 in a plane crash whose causes were never fully understood. Another enigmatic death among Soviets in the 1960s was that of Valentin Bondarenko, victim of a fire in a soundproof during endurance tests to go into space. The government banned any news about the matter at the time, and details of the tragedy were only released 25 years later. So all this mystery surrounding the Soviet space program kind of fueled the emergence of conspiracy theories. Some of them even about the supposed lost cosmonauts. And it is these stories that we will investigate from now on. Just before, and I swear it will be very quick, this t-shirt I'm wearing is part of the new collection from my store, Loose. If you want to wear t-shirts with prints of things you like and with quality, let's make a deal. Enter the website by clicking on the link in the description or pinned comment. Choose your favorite t-shirt or shirts and I will give you a 10% discount on your first purchase, because I'm sure you'll end up buying them all one day. Just use coupon code LOOSE10. And at Loose the relativistic freight. We send the t-shirt when you buy it. So enjoy the new collection and come dress the universe with me. Now, back to the video and the investigations. Does the story of the lost astronaut have a grain of truth? One of the most famous cases was that of Grigory Nelyubov. He was selected for the first Soviet class of cosmonauts. The group posed for a series of photos that were released by the government. This was one of the photos taken at the time. It turns out that, sometime later, this other photo was also released. Note that it is the same image, but one of the people was simply deleted from the original image. This man was Grigory Nelyubov. The Soviet Union says he became an undisciplined soldier and that he liked to drink. So he would be a bad example to follow and, therefore, the Soviets chose to exclude his image from history, as if he had never existed. Does anyone remember the video about Damnatio Memoriae? This strange story was enough for conspiracy theorists to wonder whether Grigory had, in fact, been a cosmonaut who died in space. The Soviet Union assured him not, and said he was transferred to a remote base in Siberia and died after being run over by a train. Oh yeah, super normal, thanks for clarifying. In any case, this was just one of several suspected cases of lost cosmonauts. In fact, another famous story involves not one, but 4 cosmonauts. The news came out in this American newspaper in 1959, that is, before Yuri Gagarin's maiden voyage. And in the newspaper it is reported that reliable sources, in what was then Czechoslovakia, guaranteed that the Russians had made 4 vain attempts to send a person into space, and one of these people would even be a woman. All these cosmonauts would have died. But a journalist specializing in space coverage discovered that, in fact, it was a group of high-altitude parachutists, who had never even been to space. A few more years, another rumor of a missing cosmonaut. It all started when there were just a few days left before the launch of Yuri Gagarin's rocket. At the time, the Soviet Union announced that another high-ranking military officer, Vladimir Ilyushin, had been involved in a serious car accident. But a British tabloid published that this story was false and that in fact Vladimir was on a space trip that failed a few days earlier. The rumor gained new versions, including that his ship had crashed in China and that local authorities had covered up the accident. Once again, experts in space exploration reviewed all the available bibliography on the subject and assured that it was all just a rumor planted in the newspapers of the time. Apparently, in fact, fake news comes from a long time ago. The war of narratives between the United States and the Soviet Union took the story without any proof to the newspaper pages, which often bought the government's version without properly investigating the information. Do you want another example? Look at this news from 1962. Soviets may have dead bodies in orbit. In the text, the American Air Defense spokesman says that the Soviets placed the first cosmic coffin in the celestial cemetery. He spoke very beautifully, but he also spoke nonsense. According to Yuri Gagarin's biography, it is most likely that this cosmonaut was, in fact, a doll. Ivan Ivanovich, who was precisely a dummy used by the Soviets in space tests. He traveled with a recording of a human voice to test whether the radio was working. And this story, in fact, resembles one of the most historic trolls ever carried out by the Soviets. In 1968, when a human being was still a year away from setting foot on the moon, the Soviet Union launched the first spacecraft that circled the moon completely. It was Zond 5, which was an unmanned spacecraft except for some plants and UNS fly eggs and also by 2 turtles. But anyway, there were no human beings. But the cosmonauts here on Earth, apparently with too much time on their hands, decided to play a prank on the Americans. They knew that the United States was always intercepting radio signals, so they left pre-recorded audio playing during the mission. And the recording said, "The flight is proceeding as normal, but we are approaching the surface of the moon." The joke left the Americans in a panic because they thought the Soviets were getting to the moon before them. The story reached the President of the United States. And do you know what he said? So I can get back to the topic of the video. This is because another story about a lost cosmonaut also emerged through trolling. It was a legend created by Spanish conceptual artist Juan Fontcuberta. That name sounds strangely strange. He held an exhibition in several countries about a supposed lost astronaut named Ivan Istoknikov. And it was all a joke. Istoknikov precisely means, covered fountain, like his surname. And the astronaut's photos were a montage with the artist's own face. Still, human beings do not disappoint. Some newspapers did not understand the objective of the exhibition. I didn't understand either, I'll be honest with you. But the fact is that several news outlets reported the case as if it were true, giving rise to yet another rumor. But of all the stories of lost cosmonauts, I saved the most famous for last. Although I opened the video with her. But now I'm going to explain better who those 2 Italian amateur radio operators were who intercepted a mysterious signal coming from space. They were the brothers Giovanni and Achille Giudica Cordiglia. They were young people fascinated by radio technology. They built equipment on the terrace itself to capture radio waves. Their story is told in the documentary called Space Hackers. The film is available free on YouTube. In the film, they say that it all started as a big joke. Until one day that changed their lives forever. The launch of Sputnik 1. The brothers found the correct frequency and recorded this audio. From then on, they began monitoring Soviet space activity from within their own home. In Sputnik 2's turn, they recorded what, according to them, would be the lay dog's heartbeat. But it was a few years later, in 1960, that they received the first signal supposedly from a lost cosmonaut. It was the distress call in Morse code that I showed at the beginning of the video. This one. Creepy. And after that, the brothers say they recorded yet other possible evidence of secret cosmonauts. In 1961, for example, radio amateurs captured what would appear to be a rapid heartbeat. This time, from a human being, accompanied by the panting of a person in space. Coincidence or not, 2 days after the broadcast, Soviet authorities admitted that they had placed a 12-meter, 7-ton spacecraft into orbit, supposedly unmanned, but which ended up catching fire. Suspect Soviet Union. The brothers then decided to improve the equipment to achieve higher quality recordings. They played the most shocking recording of all. A female voice that would be that of a cosmonaut desperately screaming for help. And precisely because it was the most shocking recording, it was also the one that raised the most suspicion. The Italian brothers were accused of having forged the audio. There was never a formal investigation into the case, but some points raised doubts about the recording. The first is the fact that no other authority in any other country was able to intercept this transmission. Could it be that, with all the apparatus of the United States intelligence service in the middle of the Cold War, only 2 young Italian radio amateurs were going to make this discovery? Furthermore, the communication made by the alleged cosmonaut did not follow any official protocol. She does not identify herself at the beginning of the transmission and also does not use technical language. Okay, if I were in a burning spaceship, plummeting toward Earth, I might not worry too much about it either. But there is still other evidence of fraud. Spacecraft are unable to communicate during re-entry to Earth. The compression of the capsule against the atmosphere generates a layer of ionized air. This interferes with radio signals and causes a blackout in communication. And for this reason, the return of astronauts to Earth is always surrounded by minutes of silence and tension. The brothers may even claim that the recording was made shortly before this stage, but there are still other questions. One of them is about the capsule. Where would she have fallen? And the other is about the cosmonaut's voice. The Russian who what she speaks has an accent that is not typical of someone born in Russia. I think that's why I didn't understand anything she said. And this makes everything even more suspicious because, pay attention to the plot twist, the ham radio brothers have a sister who speaks Russian. She claims that she learned the language precisely to help the brothers with translations. But amidst so many suspicions, well, it's very suspicious. That's why there are those who believe that she herself could have played the role of the cosmonaut in Epirus. In other words, everything would be a big act. The big problem is that all these doubts end up calling into question the veracity not only of this case of the lost cosmonaut, but of all the material produced by Italian amateur radio operators. Although what they have is a very interesting archive for analysis and debate, we have no way of proving, in the end, the veracity of these recordings. The conclusion we can reach is that, unless there was some case that was so well covered up and, therefore, never discovered, it is most likely that all the stories of lost cosmonauts that we have ever heard are false. Most likely, they are all conspiracy theories born of a misunderstanding or someone's very creative imagination. And I hope I have clarified the doubts of lost astronaut for you. Thank you very much and see you next time.